One of the great problems right now in the body of Christ, literally around the world, is that we're confusing. I say we now, this is the general we around the world, but we as the body of Christ are too often confusing the definition of mercy and grace. Now, in the Old Testament, the word grace appears some 240 times in its original Hebrew form. And the meaning of that word in the Old Testament is unmerited favor, unearned love. In fact, the truth is that mercy and grace in the Old Testament are pretty much the same thing. There's very little difference in the meaning of those words. But when we come into the New Testament, the New Covenant, the word grace that the epistle writers used is very, very different from the word they used for mercy. Mercy in the New Testament means God's unearned love, his undeserved mercy, his undeserved love. That's what mercy means. But grace in the New Testament is very, very different. Grace, every time, over 100 times that it's used in the New Testament, each time the word refers to, in some form or another, the power of God. And I have come over the years to realize that, at least for me, the best way to define grace, and I believe the way the Apostle Paul defined it and the other epistle writers, is that grace is the power of the Spirit of Christ living in and through the believer. The Spirit of God, the Spirit of grace, he's called, comes into our lives and begins a miracle of transformation. And then he begins to work through us by manifesting the nature and the character of Jesus, overcoming and overwhelming our character, our fleshly nature, and flowing in and through us in the nature of Jesus, the fruits of the Spirit. Now, this is important for us to understand. In later postings, we'll talk more scholarly, let's say, about the meaning of the word charis, which is the word grace. But suffice it to say that the writers of the New Testament made a clear distinction between the two. Listen to Hebrews chapter 4. This is where it says, "For we have a high priest who understands or sympathizes with our weaknesses, and yet he was tempted in every way but did not sin." Now he's talking about our weaknesses. He's talking about Jesus being tempted and not sinning. So the context obviously means that the weakness he's talking about is our propensity to sin, our stumbling, our failures along our Christian walk. So then he says, and when our weakness shows up, let us then approach God's throne of grace, transforming power living innocent through us, the power of the Spirit of Jesus living innocent through us. Let's come to God's throne of transforming power in and through us, grace. Let us come with confidence or boldness. Now listen, so that we may receive mercy, so when we failed, we may come to God's throne of transforming power and first of all, receive his unconditional love, be washed of our shame by his love. Shame from our weakness, from failing, from tripping up, from stumbling, from making sinful choices. But we get washed from that, but that's not enough. Forgiveness, washing is not enough. He goes on, and find grace to help us in our time of need. Verse 16. Now, what is our time of need? If we back up in the context, our time of need is when our weakness shows up. What is our weakness? Well, the very next line refers to Jesus being tempted but not sinning. So our weakness is when we sin, or if that word bothers you, when we fail, when we miss the mark, when we stumble, as James 3:2 says. But when we do that, when we fall short, what should we do? Come with boldness to God's throne of transforming power, God's throne of grace. And what do we receive? Number one, we receive his mercy, his unearned love, his eternal love. He has loved us from eternity past to eternity future. He has always loved us, but we've not always known it. So when we fall short, we simply come to him and get bathed in his unconditional love. We get renewed in our mind. When we're willing to take the blame, he's willing to wash away the shame. Christ already took the shame on the cross, but that's not enough. We now go a little bit further, understanding that the throne of God that we approach with confidence is a throne of grace. It is a throne of transforming power. So again, let us come with confidence to God's throne of grace so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Again, what's our time of need? When we act out of our own carnality, when we fall short, we come to God in our time of need. And what does he do? Washes us with his mercy, renews our mind with the truth that Jesus already paid the eternal penalty for our failure. But that's not all. Grace goes to work. Grace, his transforming power, goes to work. I would encourage you to go to markdrake.org and look in our store for a book called God's Brilliant Plan, Searching for the Easy and Light Life that Christ promised us. This book is all about the miracle and mystery of how Christ lives in us and lives through us. It's all about grace, the transforming power of the resurrection spirit. Paul says in Romans 8:11, now if the same spirit which raised Christ from the dead dwell in you, then he shall quicken, or literally put life into your mortal body. Now, how does he put life? What life does he put? We're already alive in our mortal body. He puts Christ's life inside of us, and Christ's life begins to change us from the inside out. What's the difference between mercy and grace? In the new covenant, mercy is God's everlasting, unconditional, never-ending love for you and me. It is his fatherly favor for us in our weakness. But what is grace? Grace is the transforming power of the same spirit that raised Jesus from the dead. The power that raised him from the dead is the power that's living in you if you're a believer, and it's changing you from the inside out. Put your faith in his power in you, living through you, changing you in the process. markdrake.org, and enjoy living in righteousness, peace, and joy as a free gift from the Father.